Fantasy-animation.org is a completely free online educational resource dedicated to examining the relationship between fantasy storytelling and the medium of animation. Our weekly blog posts are written by professional animators and academics and explore a range of diverse topics from the sexual identity of SpongeBob SquarePants to the practical reality of how to make an animation documentary on a pair of knickers. Our podcasts, just like this one, feature expert guests including Oscar-winning animators, esteemed academics, folklorists and fans, all of whom help take Chris and I on a seemingly never-ending journey through the history and theory of these two overlapping media, mediums and genres. To find out more, visit fantasy-animation.org. I hope you enjoy the show. Hello listeners and welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. This week I am both from the future and the past and sort of in the present at the same time, but not necessarily this present, and I still think my name's Alex Sargent.
And I'm Chris Holliday, but I might also could be Ulrich Nielsen, Magnus Nielsen or Peter Doppler.
Depending on what season of the show we're about to talk about we're in. We're here to talk about Dark, a German language Netflix show that premiered in 2017, I believe, through to 2020, and was a sort of hit for the station. Really fascinating piece of work that exemplifies a number of sort of traits in terms of science fiction's capacity to play with ideas of time, the philosophy of time, and as well as sort of some long-standing academic debates surrounding television seriality and complexity on television. So I've got loads to talk about. How about you, Chris?
I also have loads to talk about. I'm interested in sort of, I think, digital realignment and perhaps the idea of chaos. I was thinking kind of through chaos when I was watching each of the three seasons and the way in which these are worlds that are formed by both kind of chaotic projections and conjoined spaces of different media. And so, yeah, I think that fuels the sort of theme of the program, which is obviously around time travel and existentialism. And so, yeah, I'm daunted by what's about to come, but excited nonetheless.
Well, to help guide us through the complexity of the show and some of the ideas it raises is our very special guest, Nicolas Leu, who was the VFX supervisor on Dark whilst working for Rise VFX. Nicolas has worked on other big Hollywood productions in the past, like a few Marvel films, one of the Fast and the Furious franchise, and the recent live-action Dumbo, I believe. But Nicolas is here to talk to us about his role in helping create the mystery and wonder that is Dark. So, Nicolas, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on, Nicolas. Let's start with at the beginning, I guess, if such a thing can be done when we're talking about Dark. How did you come to start working on Dark? What's the story behind your involvement in the show? And what VFX work did you mainly sort of undertake as you sort of joined this world? I believe sort of partially through the sort of run of the show, if I'm not mistaken.
Sure. That kind of depends on how early you want to start. So basically, I started my career, let's start there, as a compositing artist. So I studied design and all that kinds of stuff, and I was working on film sets, doing basically as a production assistant, more or less. That's where I started off, like making coffee, basically. And then I switched into post-production editing, and then I basically, at some point, I ended up studying, and compositing was fascinated me most because of this, because, I mean, it's the last step in the VFX process, since you're the one finishing the shot, and that was something that I always found fascinating, basically being able to fine-tune the shots until they look pretty. And so I started off working freelance for different German companies mostly, and different productions. You mentioned some of the Marvel movies, for example. And then I basically I got an offer to be compositing supervisor at Rise FX in Berlin. And basically I gladly took that offer and was supervising some shows. I think one, so Ant-Man basically, and I mean not the whole show, but of course only the sequence that we were working on at Rise. So and then basically Dark. So the team behind Dark, the director, DOP, etc. They all come from the Hochschule für Film und Fernsehen in Munich. That's the Munich Film University, basically. And for them, it was the first big Netflix production, basically. And they were, like, their team, I think, they didn't have so much experience with visual effects, and they were also looking for a local vendor to work on it due to the personal contact, to be able to call and talk about things in your native language as well. I guess it makes things easier. So they approached Rise, and Rise worked on the first season. I was involved in a different project, so I didn't really work on the first season. I think I was helping out on one day on set, but apart from that, I wasn't involved. And then when the second season started, they basically asked me if I want to take on the challenge and be VFX supervisor. So the second season was my first project as a VFX supervisor as well.
Well, I've already got two questions to unpack there. First is it's a practitioner episode, everybody, so Alex asks stupid questions. So composition editor, talk me through exactly what that is, because it's not a title I'm that familiar with. I'm guessing by your description it's the process basically at the end where the effects are kind of finished to completion, but maybe I'm sure some listeners would like to know a little bit more about what that job entails and what kind of things you've done in your career. And then I'd love to talk about that journey, because actually when I heard that you joined in season 2, stupid me, I assumed that's because season 1, plot spoiler, it doesn't really take place in overtly fantastical places, and therefore there probably wasn't much VFX, but it sounds like that of course wasn't the case. So let's perhaps just start by telling us about composition editing, and then perhaps were you aware of the work going on at Weiss? What sort of stuff were they doing on season 1?
Sure. So I think, the correct term would basically be compositing artist or compositor. It's often confused because it sounds like you have something to do with music, maybe with compositioning, and I don't know. But it's basically compositing, which is the last, or it is the step where you collect everything that's been done in the VFX process. So all the different footage, if you have green screen footage, if you have a background plate, if you have CG renders, for example. So you collect everything that everybody in a VFX studio has done or that was shot on set, and you combine it to the final shot. And then basically you're responsible for the last, so first of all, making it ideally photo real, I guess, in most cases. So you have to make sure that the CG footage matches the exposure, the brightness, the black levels, the colors, the color temperature, etc. Of the plate that was shot. And there are lots of steps basically where you send out the shot to the director or the show's VFX supervisor, and then as a compositor, you go through all these iterations and move things around or make them brighter, or oftentimes certain CG steps. It depends on the VFX supervisor and the director as well, but sometimes people like so supervisors and directors like judging the material on the final image. So sometimes you have a CG render, but it doesn't get looked at because it's too abstract and it doesn't have the correct colors, etc. So people want to see it in the finished shot. So you composite it together, and then only then the director maybe says something like, the spaceship has to have a different color, and then it goes back to a certain department and so on. So that's basically compositing. Okay. And The first season, basically from season 1 to season 3, with the director and the whole crew getting more and more comfortable with using visual effects, they also wanted to try out more stuff. And it was an interesting journey because, so basically they started off very, don't want to say naively, but they really were like, what can we do? What is possible? Like they couldn't even 100% say what they wanted because they didn't exactly know yet what was possible. And then it's probably also a thing due to budget, since it was a pilot and nobody knew whether it was going to be successful or not. So in the first season, the visual effects were so there was one portal, and at the end there was this black dome that we see more often than later on. Those were like the bigger effects, or I think the more obvious things. Mm-hmm. But then, for example, the nuclear power plant is something that's not real in any of the seasons. And that's such an iconic thing for Dark, like this nuclear power plant. Fun fact, the director's father used to work in a nuclear power plant, I think. He mentioned something like that.
I'm assuming it wasn't a positive experience based on how they're portrayed in the in the show.
Who knows?
Yeah. So all of that was all CGI then. The every shot of the nuclear power plant is not a photographed real nuclear power plant somewhere.
Yes, exactly.
Wow.
So that was completely modeled and rendered in CG. The smoke or the steam was also a simulation. And in many of the shots, you were only able to see the cooling towers, but then there were also shots where you saw the gate and the whole facility behind the gate, but that was also CG.
So I have lots of questions, and I suppose I'm coming to Dark from the perspective of when me and Alex first sort of, or when me, Alex, and Rise actually had conversations about what to do and where we might go with this, and Dark was suggested. I thought, great, a science fiction program. I'll watch that, and there'll be CG effects everywhere, and it'll be really easy for me to make notes about what is in the frame. And then I thought, well, actually, Dark's a really good example of sort of the various ways that computer processing and digital imagery constantly moves between sort of these invisible support roles and then these more sort of central, obtrusive, conspicuous and then also back again, and it continually moves between those two things. And a lot of writing on CGI is I suppose, about issues of disclosure, about what is explicitly an artifact, what is being veiled. And I looked at some of the behind the scenes work from Rise, I guess they're production reels, and was looking at the sort of differences between the seasons and the type of images that were being rendered. And the first season looks like it's more about the layering of backgrounds, largely speaking, and that kind of industrial imagery of cooling towers and the smoke and other little bits, so kind of little bits of crowds and dead birds perhaps and cows and the little brass machine thing that I'm not going to spoil. But I'm interested in, and I've been reading about big and small, so effects that you notice and effects that you don't, and the big ones like green screen, and then the tiny little things, and they all have got to work together. This convergence of simulations has to work together constantly. The big and the small, and the micro and the macro, and they've all got to work together to maintain this the persuasiveness of the illusion, and no one bit can. I suppose that's where chaos theory and actually works really nicely with Dark as a program. If you change one thing as a knock-on effect in the way that the narrative of Dark works. And it's kind of exactly like these visual effects where if one thing looks out of place, you go, right, well, what else is out of place? And then it has a knock-on effect. And so they all these big and small elements have to work together. And that's what I found really fascinating in the first season. I was really struggling to find the digital effects, and I had to kind of spoil it for myself and look at the making of and Rise's production reel to try and find the seams and the joins, and so I kind of I appreciated the show anew because I was it's I suppose that's a a desire on my part to know the seams of production, but I just found it sort of really fascinating to try and find where it was. And I suppose my question is going to be, when you then move on to series 2, is there a real right we're now, because I thought the effects imagery was a lot more conspicuous and a lot more, you're sort of making material, you're making time travel material. It looks like something. There are portals and things, and so I guess if we move on to, or I suppose your work and your labour, you're moving on to series 2. Did it feel like a real shift in the kinds of images that you were producing from that sort of relatively invisible effects? Did it feel like a real, okay, we're doing something different now for season 2?
Yeah, so basically the same way the team evolved and wanted to try more and make it a little more obvious, I guess, and also based on the story, because the first one everything was shrouded in mystery. Like, you didn't know how time travel would, like, how it works, who's involved, why it works.
Why is everyone related in the thing? It's so confusing.
Exactly. So that's why the second season also tried to shed more light onto these aspects, I think, and give basically show it takes away a little bit of the magic, I guess, but it's also a part where you kind of you're at the point where I think as a viewer, you want to understand what's going on. At least, you probably still don't understand fully what's going on since it's still dark, but at least you get to see something more that was hidden before. And that was also the most interesting challenge for season 2, because basically the director approached us very early with a very, very early concept. He basically did some research on the internet and found a few things and elements that he found interesting, that he showed us, that were basically what should have been needed to be the black matter, which is, I'm not sure how much I can spoil or not, but
I spoil away. I've already mentioned time travel, and we've gone a little bit down that road. So
listeners should be watching advance, but I'll let you decide where you wish to spoil it.
There's some black matter, all right. We've spoiled it. There's some wonderfully animated black matter. But anyway, sorry, Nick, let's carry on.
All right. So yeah, basically the director approached us with this very early concept of what the black matter should look like, and it was basically just so black goo, and the way it was described in the first draft of the screenplay was basically that it's some kind of gooey black self-swallowing matter, and it's almost alive, kind of. So that was what we were starting with, and then we tried lots of different simulations, and we ended up having multiple layers that moved in different directions, and we were basically able to adjust the strength of how far it would reach out, so that we could make it more like a digital actor in a sense. So we could have it move more aggressively or be more silent depending on the situation. So I think that was a big part basically of the second season. Like the black matter was by far the biggest new CG element, and as you correctly said, we moved into this more simulation and FX heavy approach basically, which was, FX wise, the first season was really more or less limited to the portal, which we only saw in like 2 shots.
I had a question about the black goo, about the dark matter. In that I obviously that's struck me as being exactly what Chris is talking about. One of these explicit effects. It's very much we are the audience, whilst cued into sort of accepting the integration of that image with the live action components, is nevertheless sort of not expected necessarily to think this is anything that's been filmed in real life. This is something to be enjoyed as Chris likes to say, as a special effect. And part of what makes something a special effect is they need to be considered special. So like this is the special of the special effect on screen. And I just wondered if I was going to ask about a question of sort of whether the context of when these shots are used was part of your thinking at all? And just to sort of explain what I mean by this, in a show like Dark, where so much of what is on screen is completely dependent on the sort of the complex story surrounding it, particularly with Dark, because in Dark, a shot can mean something very different depending on what way we're viewing this particular time we're in, indeed what time we're in. Individual characters can be different versions of themselves, or indeed entirely different characters. And it's interesting you said this sort of digital actor. I mean, the dark matter is very much a sort of character in the story, and yet sometimes, like when we first see it, it's in the sort of futuristic world where it's kind of normalized as part of like, well, we're now in a sci-fi landscape, so like, you know, of course there's things like this in a futuristic dystopia, but seeing it turn up again in 1980s or in sort of present day, it has a very different sort of fantasy register. So I just wondered, you know, did it matter as in terms of which shot did it matter in terms of what's going on in the narrative when this appeared? Did you want the dark matter to be a different kind of character or to be looked at differently depending on how it's being used in the story? And if so, I'm sure that meant you had to kind of keep up, just like us, with what on earth's going on in any individual moment or in any individual shot, right? Or was it a case of like, okay, we've got what the character does, now we can apply that character pretty much to any setting we like, as long as we're true to the character of the dark matter, so to speak?
So it was a little bit like when you're working on a character, you have to create a facial rig basically, and have to enable you. So you have to give the digital character the ability to show certain emotions or do something, some different types of facial expressions, etc. So with the black matter, it was similar in a way that, of course, it didn't need a facial rig or something like this, but we basically had a few elements built in, so we could determine how fast it should move, how far the expansion should go, and we had this special layer which enabled this transition from the unstable and wild black matter to this perfect round ball, basically. And another big question was then also, because there was also this moment where it needs to open up and swallow whole people. And then also the other question was what's going on inside the black matter. So all these were different elements that the black matter had to do, and they were also represented in the screenplay, because as a contrast to what I was saying earlier, this self-swallowing, chaotic black matter, it was also described as a very silent and safe thing, more or less. So it was not that menacing anymore once it's in this stable form. So that was basically the contrast that we had to work with, and that was absolutely dependent on the scene's context, basically. Because another thing was also, and that's why we started that early with working on the black matter, because we had to have at least the concept for the black matter had to be done before shooting, since you can't tell the actors on set, imagine that there is like this wild energy ball that nobody has ever seen before, without showing them at least something. So that's why we had a very an early concept that already could do all these swallowing movements, and that already had these blue particles and the smoke surrounding the black matter before shooting started. So when I was on set, basically I could show the actors, look at this. This is this is what's in front of you, and that was a good way of showing people how they should react to it.
That's really interesting, because this is coming from someone that deals mainly in the popular discourse surrounding special effects. There's this perception, right, that the actors turn up on set and there's green screen and some tennis balls, and then the actors do their imagining and pretend like there's a space alien, Jar Jar Binks, Gollum, whatever the sort of CGI character that you want to sort of instill in it. And then they always tell these stories, don't they, where they turn up at the premiere and are shocked and amazed to see what work's been done since then, where they've now witnessing their the things they've been acting with appear on screen. But it's and that kind of progressive linear process from acting live to VFX work is in much the same way as Dark plays with time. It sounds like it's not quite so chronological, in that to help the actors imagine, and I'm all about imagining on this podcast, but to help the actors sort of fantasize into their roles and fantasize what they're doing, the technology has to be there front and center from the start of the process, right? Is that common on most shoots you've worked on, or is that something particular to Dark?
I think it's not that common, to be honest, because
Okay.
most of the work happens later, and it's also because of the decision-making process. So oftentimes, you have an idea of what's gonna be in there, of course, but it's just so work-intensive that you will only have a previs of some sorts, maybe gray shaded or something like that. But for the black matter, it was necessary basically to have it before, because it's also I guess it's easier to tell somebody, imagine there is a big UFO over there, or even if it's imagine there's a big pyramid or something that they've already seen before, that they can imagine. But the black matter, I mean, everybody understands something else when you say imagine there's a black matter. It could be everything. So I guess it was important to have something that represents the vision of the director already to show people.
It seems like and I'm going to go because I'm interested in the relationship, I think, between your labour and your role as the sort of compositor as the final stage. And I'd never really registered that was the final stage. And I think that I guess frames what I'm about to say. But it seems like the production of something like Dark behind the scenes matches a television program that takes in, where are we, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 time periods at least, and is all about doubling and causality and the knotting together of family trees. And so there's a degree of narrative chaos, I think, and chaos has often been described as a way of thinking about our audiovisual experience of kind of bombastic Hollywood cinema. I think it's Matthias Stork who's written a piece on chaos cinema as part of a sort of sensory overload where you get fragmented, shot lengths are really short, you get an intensification of intensified continuity, you get fragmentation, imprecision, precarity, and your job is to sort of, and this is replicated presumably then in the CGI where you've got that thing over there matching together with that thing, a live action plate, in other contexts perhaps a model, digital effects that are veiled, digital effects that are supposed to be registered as effects and special. And so your job is to sort of, as compositor, is to sort of smooth out our understanding of an experience of sort of chaos, because you're touching up things, and you mentioned about sort of bringing things all together and making them look photorealistic, and so you're really trying to kind of ground all the images as if they were a part of one shot, but also one time and one space. So you're trying to do what we as spectators do by pulling all these time periods together of a digital effect shot that took 2 months and a live action plate that was filmed just a month ago, or maybe 3 months ago, and you're sort of trying to pull in all these different. I'm not suggesting that you started your work in 1986, nor am I suggesting that they're still working on it in 2053. But there is a sense in which you're trying to pull all these different time periods together, and actually compositing is a real. There's a real, and of course you know this because you are it, but like a real pressure to get everything coherent, and presumably then that's then amplified by the fact that the program itself is so disjointed, but deliberately so, and in a good way. And so I just wondered, do you feel that sense of chaos when you're bringing all these things together, all these different elements, or is it quite a, I guess, a cathartic moment of just everything coming together nicely, and it looks like it was all part of the same shot, and we don't see the chaos.
I guess it really depends on the production. So sometimes it's more chaotic. Sometimes you can just it's basically like watching a house being built or something like that. Like you can see every step. But most of the productions, to be honest, it's like you build a house, you basically you burn it down, you build it again, you build another house next to it, you look at both houses close to each other or next to each other, and then you decide you don't want a house at all, you want a car. So
I have a question about damage as well. You pulling, because a lot of your work seems to be pulling buildings down as much as building them up. You end up having to ruin them as well, which must be incredibly satisfying.
Oh yes, we actually did that for the second season, because there's this shot with Jonas in the future. And the church is destroyed, and we built the whole church using as a reference. Basically, we looked through old books of church, like northern church building. It was like some kind of Danish architecture, and we built the whole wooden church with everything that it had to have, like structural integrity and everything. And then we created a simulation to destroy it, so that we could make sure that everything looks cool.
So I've always wanted to know that, because I think I've written on Hollywood films that blow up London, and you have these spectacular scenes of ravaged buildings and cityscapes and urban decimation, and I always wondered that whether you just animate the debris, or whether you build the building first and then destroy what you've already built. So I've always wanted to know that. So you build the building and then destroy it.
Yeah, I mean, in order to make it look most like as realistic as possible, and since all these basically all the physical simulations, they are based on physics.
Right.
So you can give the elements a certain weight, a certain density, etc. And that's how you make it look realistic, by just mimicking physics, which is also what we do in compositing. Because I mean, basically, the way we shoot movies, it's also based on physics. It's light entering through a lens, and we have to do the same thing basically in compositing. When you match CG footage, you basically match the CGI footage to the physics that caused the shot on set, and just because you mentioned it earlier, so basically this chaos. So it's really interesting how, if you're working as a compositor, at least that's my experience, because I transitioned from being a compositing artist to being a compositing supervisor, and then finally to a VFX supervisor. And you always, like, with every job, you get to deal more with the bigger picture, I guess. If you're a compositor, you deal with the single elements of your shot. So you approach the CG artist and, let him know, hey, do you have an update for this and that layer? And you're responsible for your shot. And then maybe if you're a sequence lead, you're responsible for your sequence. And then if you're a compositing supervisor, you're responsible for all the shots that your compositors are basically working on. To make sure that, because it's individual people working on all the different shots. So if you have 5 shots and every single shot has a different, like the building in the background is always shifted a little bit, or you have a different color temperature. So you have to make sure that all these are coordinated. And then as a VFX supervisor, you're basically responsible for the whole show, more or less, or the VFX of the whole show, that everything basically adds up as the bigger picture. And of course, you're the person that communicates with the director. So you have to make sure that the director's vision is accurately displayed.
I mean, this is photorealism, as you said earlier. It's not you're matching up the footage, like you talked about, sort of as part of the seams, and matching up your digital footage with the live action plates, and to make that seamless. It's obviously, that's photorealism. It's not the replication of the real world. It's the replication of lens-based media, how light refracts. You talked about a lens earlier on. It's mimicking physics, and it's mimicking the behavior of a real camera apparatus. This is what I try and, when talking to my students about forms of digital realism, you have realism, And then you have a sort of photorealism, which is, it's like those paintings which are really hyper-realistic paintings of photographs. It's sort of an abstraction. It's Andy Darley called like second-order realism. It's not realism, it's like the realism of realism. And that layering I find really interesting, and presumably, yeah, it helps you. If you're not thinking about what does a tree look like outside, you're looking at the tree as if it was filmed in a camera with distortions perhaps and light refracting off of it, which I think that's an added thing, and within the pursuit of imperceptible images that you can't tell which was. And as I said, it season 1 absolutely got me. I had to ruin it for myself to find out what was digital and what wasn't. So
yeah. Which it is also a really important step as a set supervisor. So in most cases, or in many productions, the VFX supervisor will also be the person that is present on set. And the capturing of data is basically a huge step in creating realistic visual effects. Because so on set, basically, apart from showing the actors where the black matter or how it looks like, of course, you have to collect all the data. So for every shot, you have to write down what lens was being used, what camera was being used. Ideally, and nowadays, since we have the possibilities, one tool that we used extensively for dark was a LiDAR scanner. So it's basically a very expensive thing that can scan the environment and create a 3D model, basically. Right. I had that with me on every shooting day, and I always scanned every single environment. Takes quite a while because you have to scan from multiple locations, since you have to be able to view every angle, and then you combine all these scans to one 3D model. And that's what we used in order to be able to accurately place the black matter, for example, in the scene, exactly where it has to go, at exactly the size where it has to be. And because sometimes it's also just guesswork, and you kind of want to avoid having to guess how big something has to be. For example, we had something like this with the cooling towers. We had a shot, and we put in the cooling towers, and the director thought that they were too big. And we could, since we had all this data, we could tell him, no, it's exactly the correct size at this distance. Of course, we can move it further back, and then it appears smaller, but
the scale was right. The scale was, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, interesting. I'd never really thought about that. The scaling of and you would know if it would read wrong as well. So you'd have to get and also the way that you talk about your work, as you were there shooting and you were scanning. So it's an extra part of this process where to create these 3-dimensional models that then go into the computer that then get matched up with all these areas. But yeah, fascinating.
Well, and to sort of add to that. There's a book by a scholar named William Brown that we cite on this podcast quite a lot, which is a book called Super Cinema, and it's talking about sort of VFX imagery and digital imagery, and he makes the analogy in the book that digital cinema is kind of like Clark Kent is to Superman, or is it, no? It's yes, in the Clark Kent is really Superman. He's really the all-doing, all-knowing, can be anything, can go anything, is not bound by any physics that we know, but he pretends to be the journalist wearing glasses stumbling around the office because that will endear him more to the people that surround him. And in a way, kind of digital effects does the same, right? And the digital effects doesn't have to be representational. It can be abstract. It's not bound by a kind of physics located in gravity and all the kind of stuff that we might expect in our day-to-day lives when we use the word physics. And yet sounds like you spend a lot of your labour trying to make it look like Clark Kent, trying to make it look like it was filmed. The idea of making sure the dark matter looks filmed. If you just say that out loud, it's insane because it's not a substance that could be filmed. It's and I think perhaps to extend that analogy that we like to play with on the podcast, it's not just that it's a superhero. It's that digital technology is actually analog celluloid photographic realism is Newtonian physics. It's gravity. It's space. It's time. It's forces. It's things that are felt. It's things that we process in our day-to-day lives. But the thing that Dark gets at narratively and as an experience and in terms of VFX is that the reality behind all of this is something much more Eisensteinian, much more kind of, abstract and brief history of time, and the sort of stuff that when you start trying to understand, you go a bit cross-eyed because it doesn't seem to make any sense in terms of a living, breathing, embodied human being, because it's so counter to how we think the world is structured when you actually take it down to its sort of granular level. So in a way, it's almost like there are two types of physics going on in what you're doing. There's the physics of digitality, which is Eisensteinian and binary and numbers and abstract and incomprehensible, I guess, if you let it sort of be its fullest. And you're using that technology to bring to bear a photographed, lived-in reality. So there's again another parallel between what the show is doing, in which that a lot of what the show is asking you to do as a viewer is to almost, after about a season and a half, let go of this futile pursuit of chronological ABC, because if you start trying to do it, it'll just make you cross-eyed, and accept the kind of grander narrative that time is cyclical, that there is no time, that time, and I don't know where this is all going. A bunch of thoughts, really, but it's interesting that you spend a lot of your labour trying to make something that is inherently not representational, or it doesn't have to be in any essential way, perform to a grammar that almost confines its possibilities rather than sort of flourishes it. I don't know.
I think it's a good analogy, because for a VFX artist, I mean, it's the biggest compliment is to tell him that you didn't see what he's done. So if because I mean I've been working on shows where in the end you only kept the face of the actor basically, and everything else was replaced due to sometimes you can plan ahead, but sometimes decisions are being made so late in the production that you already shot the scene. The actor is already working on a whole different project. You can't just organize a reshoot or something, and then you basically just end up recreating a whole scene more or less. And if the viewer doesn't see that, like if you just enjoy the movie without having any other thoughts than being focused on the actual story. And that's quite a huge compliment for every person working in VFX, I think.
I feel like my work here is done because Alex has made a reference to a visual effects text, and the merging is complete. I just think it's interesting that and lots of writers would talk about this and the digital aesthetics, that realism was very quickly became an aim, and certainly scholars writing on digital effects came up with a number of terms to try and make sense of the problem of digital realism. We had simulationist, perceptual realism, second-order realism, photorealism, hyperrealism, and then a couple of scholars pulled all of that in together under the guise of remediation, that one media remediates and looks like another. The computer doesn't look like anything, but what it does look like, it can look like anything. It can look like a pencil line on a piece of paper. It can look like black matter or dark matter. It can look like this. And so the idea of remediation is that digital technology will always, it's sort of rooted, I guess, in its sort of fundamental parseness. Again, going back to this analogy of time and what Dark is all about, the merging of time travel, this combination of families, and this idea of remediation, where new media technologies simulate older media in this kind of pursuit of standards of photorealism that we're not supposed to notice. I think, roots CGI in a fundamental parseness, because it's always a recollection of analog media. It's a recollection of lens-based media that is now being reworked and made available in the present thanks to these sorts of, I guess, the representative qualities of CGI, or the appropriative qualities of CGI, and pristine digital imagery that can always digital images pull everything in and go, right, we'll look like that, and we'll look like that, and we'll bring that together. And so the idea of time in relation to the digital is a whole other portal to another realm. But I think there's lots to say about photorealism as itself, and it's the term that you use to sort of bring together your role as the compositor to make everything look photoreal. That's rooted in a fundamental parseness, because it's going back to an older media, potentially.
Let me ask a slightly more practical question, because as I say, I feel like Dart, we've
gone theory, Alex. We've gone
expanding into an
Apologies.
abstract abyss. So, a question that I really wanted us to explore, because it taps into something I'm very interested in, is the process of making VFX on television, if indeed we're going to call this television, because obviously it was on Netflix, and that raises a whole other bunch of questions. But if you're happy to accept that term, I am, versus in feature film, because there must be some. I'm interested in the sort of the aesthetic differences, but let's start with the practical differences. Was there a difference in the working model if you're working on a show like this versus a feature film, or was it pretty much the same given Netflix's mode of distribution?
I think one big difference is always in between film and TV shows is probably just the amount of shots. I mean, because it's just for a show like Dark, which had the first season had 10 episodes, and then we had 8 episodes for season 2 and 3, and I think it was like 45 minutes or 1 hour. So you have, I don't know, 4 times the length of a normal feature film for one season. So of course you have to create more and more shots, and but there's still some budgetary constraints. Like you cannot just create the same style, I guess, of visual effects that you would do for a feature film. You start filling up by replicating, I guess. So we have we have the black matter as one example, or the cooling tower. So you have these specific CG elements that you need to tell your story, and you basically use them in a different context for different shots. But you wouldn't you wouldn't create 5 or 10 different black matters, because it's just, I'm not sure if it makes sense, of course, first of all, but then also it would be way too expensive to produce this amount of effects for just one TV show. And even if you look at other TV shows, I think, I mean, the start basically where I think so. Game of Thrones was basically a paradigm shift for this, I think, because up until then, TV shows were always inferior in quality compared to feature films. And now with Game of Thrones, it was the first time where they really took a huge budget and used it to make proper VFX, and you had armies and these big camps basically, and dragons, of course. And everything looked awesome, and I think that's really when it started. So that also other production companies or Netflix, for example, looked at these kinds of shows and said, we can also do it for feature film.
I'm interested that you raised Game of Thrones as an example there, because I think Dark shares an element of Game of Thrones, and I wonder if this is perhaps not something that's consciously felt, but it's part of the practicalities of making television production, which is that you mention the things in Game of Thrones that people think of if you say, oh, you remember those effects in Game of Thrones that were paradigm shifting, the big dragon fights, the armies, the things we all remember. But of course, they're actually from the sort of second half, or predominantly from the second half of the series, right? And that, if you go back and watch season 1 of Game of Thrones, I'm sure there are lots of VFX work in it, and the quality is strong, but it hasn't got the same level of complexity. In that the show's a little bit more austere. It's a bit more. There aren't dragons in it. It's much more like a historical drama, and so it's almost like the show had to prove that it worked without these big, huge effects before they would be allowed to play with the big effects. And there's a story I know from that series, and that there is a battle in the book that they did want to shoot, but they just couldn't afford to because the budget was a lot lower those days. So it's like one of the main characters gets knocked out just at the start of the battle, and then he wakes up and it's all over, and that means they only had to hire a few extras, right, for the day rather than have to do the whole thing. So it's almost like, industrially they have to prove in a first season the show works without the VFX before they can use the things that they then become most well known for. And there's an element of that to Dark too, in that your work, the explicit stuff that we're talking about, it's other than the final sort of episode of season 1, it's not there. So I mean, is that part of it, in that almost like to get the budget you need to give the effects justice, you sort of almost first have to prove you can do it without it, which is not the case of, say, the latest Marvel film, or
Yeah, I think there's some truth to it, definitely. Because I mean, I guess if I were responsible for the budget at Netflix, basically, I sure definitely want to know whether an idea works before I throw so much money on it. So so I can totally understand that yeah, that's just the way it works, I guess.
But what that interestingly creates is that there's this theory of television by a scholar named Jason Mittell, who talks about sort of television narrative, and he argues that sort of what makes television different from film is that it's more complex, that the storytelling's more complex, there's more characters. I mean, this is something that viewers can pick up on from themselves, but it's worth putting it into words. But one of the things he says is that therefore actually television often doesn't deal with special effects in the sort of wow, that's a cool image sense of the word. It deals with narrative special effects. So The Sopranos has special effects in it, in that there are moments of, oh my god, wow, in it, but it's because a character's done something that you weren't expecting and you've been watching it for 10 hours, so the level of investment is there. So what Dark seems to do, which is interesting, is it almost doubles that up, is that the special effects are what we would call narrative special effects, because the moment they step into the future and we realise that, oh my god, this thing's going into, it's not just a story of it's not Back to the Future, it's far more grand than that, is both a narrative special effect but also involves your works, the CGI special effects, so it kind of doubles them together. So there's an added significance to what you're doing, in that it's not just like, oh look, here is, it's not Iron Man, it's not what you're paying the money for, it's this will fundamentally change the nature of the show simply through the act of display that I'm doing. I get to do the ta-da narrative moment. I'm not just there to accompany the narrative. I am the narrative. I mean, did you feel any of that significance when you worked on that actually what you were doing was altering the very nature of the show, and there'd be a lot of excitement for this new kind of sort of VFX work in the series from the fans who had already fell in love with the show in the first series?
Oh, definitely. It was so creating the black matter on all the effects that surrounded, like the portal. And also, if we jump to season 3, the whole mirror universe and this other time travel effect, basically this golden ball, basically this other time machine. So all these elements were fundamental to the story, and being in charge more or less, or being able to create these effects. Because the relationship between us and the director was pretty good, because I knew him since season 2, and I knew him from set, so we could just talk freely to each other, and it was a cool relationship because he was also giving us the freedom to explore all these effects and show him what we think, and then he would decide whether he likes it or not, or which direction he prefers. So that was a really cool step. And I also, since all these effects are so significant to the story, it was funny to see that compared to other projects I've been working on, the team was also super motivated. They most of the people working on the show were actual fans of the show, which doesn't happen all the time. Like for me, first time I had that was while working on Game of Thrones on season 2. I was always listening to the audiobooks while working on the season, and I always kind of wanted to finish so that I could actually see it. And then with Dark, it was, for me and for the rest of my team, it was similar. Most of the people working there were big fans, and it was cool to see, since you wouldn't be spoiled basically by working on it, because it was still super confusing. So you could still watch all the seasons, even if you've already been working there. Because, I mean, seeing the black matter doesn't give away all the complex things that are going on.
At the same time, I suppose the first season, if each of these seasons or series in lots of ways differs from the previous one, and the effects do different things, or they go in different directions, and there's actually a lot of emphasis, going back to this sort of series 1 conundrum, there's a lot of emphasis on establishing a world in that first series that is hospitable to the kinds of effects that would appear in series 2 and 3. And actually what the first series has to do in perhaps a more veiled use of digital effects, or a mode of visual effects where the chaos or the black matter is hidden, the dark matter is hidden, is to, because it's dealing with if I remember, 3 time periods: 2019, 1986, and 53. I think and I really like the 80s stuff. I think the 80s stuff is terrific, actually. But it has to set up a fictional world and create timelines and create disparate parts and chronologies, and set up relationships between characters that seem to kill themselves but then come back as, anyway, there's lots and lots of things where people are searching for their own father as a boy who's their brother as well. Anyway, so there's lots of that. So the first series has to show its visual effects but not tell. It has to do something to create a world that, because I think you used the word mystery earlier, that the first series is a lot more rooted in mystery. And then I wrote, as we move through and we get kind of the black matter, we get the floating orb sphere-y thing, we get, and this kind of amorphous space, as you said, we get the conflicting parallel timelines in series 3. Time travel becomes not just something that the characters talk about and experience as it is in the first series, but it's now something that actually impacts the way that the world looks in series 2 and 3. And so there's something really interesting about the job of the first series to set up a world that is believable and logical, and a space in which time travel is possible. But equally, when we shift to season 2 and the effects start to become perhaps more visible or bombastic or spectacular, that we have to say, oh, this is still the same world, we're just catching up to it at different points in its life cycle. And so actually I think there's something to be said about the first series is sort of plays its cards quite close to its chest. It bluffs really well and doesn't give away its tell, if you like. And so I do love certain episodes, and this actually leads me to I guess we're moving towards the end, and I had a question about favourite moments or favourite things that you've animated, but there are odd little moments in season 2 and 3. So episode 1 of season 3, Deja Vu, and there's an episode halfway through the middle of season 2 which I really like, whose name escapes me. But is there something across all those 3 seasons and all the different iterations of special effects that you've worked in, both really visible and both perhaps more veiled or hidden, is there something that you're sort of particularly proud of, or particularly like, we need to watch Dark because I did that kind of thing?
Well, there's many things, actually.
Excellent. People are normally really modest when we ask that. They're like, oh, not much. So I'm really pleased you were like, I'm really proud of lots of it. So yeah, what bits are you sort of really drawn to?
So I think basically all these different. So for me, the black matter is basically the biggest thing, because I'm so happy with how it turned out, and that it gets. It gets the emotions that you were supposed to feel when seeing it. I think it transfers it. It tells it very, very well, and especially also when listening to it with sound, basically. Because when we work in visual effects, we never listen to anything. Like, we only watch the pictures. We don't. Like, I don't know how the black matter is supposed to sound. I heard it the first time when watching the finished series. And it was funny to see how the sound that it actually made, like this dark humming kind of sound, that was exactly, I didn't know it at that point, but when I saw it and heard it, it was exactly, it brought exactly the experience that I imagined it would have to be. And I also imagined when I was when I was at the after show party, I met the guy who did the sound for the first time, actually. Since he wasn't on set, he was basically an audio engineer, post-production. So we met, and he was like, hey, the black matter, it looked so great. And I was like, well, it sounded so great as well. And we were just basically complimenting each other all the time. And
that's audio vision together, isn't it? You working together, and him not knowing what it's going to look like, or maybe he did know what it looks like, but he didn't know what sound it would make, and you animating it in silence. And that idea of, well, what sound do special effects make, and what sound do fantasy creatures or objects or matter make, is again a whole different. In the alternative timeline of this podcast, we'll do that as well. But
yes.
There's, I think, the idea of sound, that what sound do special effects make, and I just love this idea that you're at a party and going, it's this talking about black matter, as you said. The sentence sounds insane, but and also it reminded me of what Alex said earlier about the black matter as it moves through time, and I just had visions of it in the 2020 with like a long grey beard, and you didn't age it. You didn't. Oh, this is the really young dark matter, and then this is the really old kind of craggy version. But yeah, there's so much in the show. There really is, and if people haven't caught it, they definitely should. Alex, any final bits and bobs?
Well, what I was going to ask, what give us a favourite moment that perhaps we wouldn't even know, or the casual viewer wouldn't know is an effect or has any CGI in it that
That's a good
you're
question.
proud on.
Ooh, let me think about that a little bit. I mean, I think I would say the not only the nuclear power plant, but also the surrounding environment. That's something that you might not necessarily notice, that it's also partly or full CG. So we have some aerial shots, for example, where we replaced, I think, 80% of the environment in some cases, and you wouldn't necessarily know that it is CG if you don't see it, basically.
There are a few bits. Sorry, there are bits that I remember seeing online where you're sort of using the green screen to really extend the geography of the space into the. And again, I suppose you normally think of the additions, the additive function of CGI as much as the subtractive, erasing things, adding things in. But I think, and again, it's where your eye is drawn. There were lots of elements of the landscape and horizon lines and things that characters are working with. Complex but also rudimentary sets, and your job is to extend the world into the horizon and build walls and stuff like that. And I guess I suspect you probably had to do quite a bit of removing the so-called real world, right? I suspect there were lots of planes you had to take out of the 1950 scenes, or things in the sky, or things that in the background from real life in the location shots. Did you have to do any of that, or was it a tightly controlled set where none of that sort of bled into the photography?
No, definitely. For all the exterior sets, we had to do that as well, and those are also more like the invisible steps that you don't necessarily think of, because it's like the first step. Like, you get the footage, you first have to prepare the footage and remove everything that's not supposed to be there before you add the other things that you want to be in there. And all the interior sets were shot inside the studio, so it was a controlled environment. Basically, we didn't have any or almost no real locations. It was also perfect due to the shooting circumstances. Like, it's way easier to shoot in a controlled environment like a studio. But for the scenes outside, we shot in different places in and around Berlin, and we definitely had to remove some elements like electrical towers, trees, buildings.
You didn't have any Starbucks coffee moments, did you, where you had to remove something that they'd left on set or left it in or anything like that? Don't have to tell us if you left it in. We won't look for it. Spoiler.
No, we sometimes had these things as well. Yeah, of course. I mean, sometimes there's just something lying around, like also cables or I don't know, a crew member that didn't leave the frame.
Out of shot.
Yeah, sure.
Get out of shot. Actually, I suppose one of the other things is that this is set in a fictional town as well, or a fictional space, and so there's that added element where you're based from in the real world, but you are fictionalizing this real space, this Winden that looks like a sort of anywhere, but at the same time is nowhere. I cannot go and visit it, but
it's a little bit like Springfield in The Simpsons. So there's this Winden, and nobody really knows where it exactly is.
Yeah, all the geography, but it's sort of coherent. Yeah, I mean, I must admit, when I was watching it, I had a lot of online diagrams open of family trees and things like this to make sense of it. And I guess we kind of had this conversation when we did Inception, and this is, and I wrote as part of my notes, this is using layering and conjoined spaces, but it's not Inception. It's not doing it in that way, and the way we appreciate the effects and don't notice the effects, and maybe that the effects are one of the most coherent elements of a story that is highly confusing at the level, or not confusing, but confusing and complex at the level of narrative, and maybe the effects and the compositing ground everything and at least create a visual coherency that hides both the disjunctive and different times and the mixing of media, and also really brings together different time periods and helps support, I think, the narrative complexity of the show, definitely.
Yeah. So one thing that I also really enjoyed was actually the complexity, because there's so many shows nowadays that are that always have this the structure where you have to explain everything to the viewer without leaving any room for imagination. And I thought it was really cool when watching the first season. I watched it with my wife, and we all had these little theories about who could be who, because I think it's episode 3 when they first show the different images of different people and actually start explaining it in some sense. And it was cool to be able to build your own theories, and then after a few episodes you will see whether you were right or not. And I was like, with one character, I think, not sure who it was, I think it was Jonas or so, but my theory was right and my wife was wrong, and it was like, I told you so. And that continued on during the second and the third season. And I think it's a very thin line, actually, because I mean, Dark was was very confusing for some people also, of my friends, and I actually enjoyed this complexity, but you kind of have to see how far you can go without being too complex. And that was, but I thought it was really cool to have such a show with such a different approach to storytelling. And then, well, one thing that we haven't touched on yet, but that I also thought was interesting, it was a German TV show. So I think before Dark, I cannot imagine not one good sci-fi mystery TV show that was produced in Germany, to be honest. And that's a huge part of that, I think, is Netflix. That basically have different quality standards, or just a different way of working with things and bringing this quality to a German TV show that was then also quite successful internationally, was just amazing for me to see as well. And because the whole narrative or the whole visual storytelling, I think, is also, I don't want to say German, but it's definitely different than you're used to when you look at typical American productions, because there's not a lot of editing going on. So there's a lot of these very wide shots, which makes it a little more realistic, I think, because it feels like you've been there and you watched it. And if you look at, because there's one scene where a person gets shot in the second season, and there's no editing back and forth and shoot me, no, don't do it, and all that kind of, the person just gets shot and that's it. And it looks kind of brutal, but also real. So that's also something from a visual storytelling perspective that I really enjoyed. And just to add a little bit on the Germanness, we grew up, like I grew up in Germany, but I grew up with all these American movies. So I'm actually very familiar and used to this whole college thing with, you have your little locker. We don't have those things in Germany, but it feels natural to me because I know it from all the movies that I've watched as a child. But then being able to see the world in the 80s, how I actually experienced it in Germany and not this American kind of 80s environment, was also a funny experience because you don't see these things that often.
Yeah. No, I actually had a note about the kind of shots in Dark, and you're right that I wrote shots of often very calm and very languid, or a space of contemplation, and actually that only seems to counterpoint exactly the sort of chaos behind the scenes. But a lot of formally the program, I think, doesn't try to do too much. It lets you take in this, and I think that adds to the mystery. You take in this space, and you're learning about the different kinds of characters, and both their illicit relationships with each other, their historical relationships with each other, their problematic relationships with each other, and you're trying to get a sense of their knotted connections. And the program really lets you do that. It doesn't, and so I absolutely agree that there's something, and maybe that was destabilizing my expectations of science fiction, but there was something really striking about the style of the program overall, as a complement, or in which your effects are also a part. I mean, there's lots to say, and I want to we could go on forever. We could go on to 2053, but we won't, Alex.
But we won't. Don't worry. Yes. No, absolutely. And I think if I'm going to take anything from this episode, well, I'm going to take lots from it. But a thing that's crystallizing is that there's a lot of writing on science fiction as being sort of in many ways as invested in the process of scientific inquiry as it is as a creative art. In the even thing, if you think back to sort of early science fiction writers like Jules Verne or H.G. Wells, or even someone like Arthur C. Clarke, these are very much thinkers of science who happen to be using fiction to sort of articulate their thoughts, but are very much indebted to a sort of philosophy or an intellectual. They are doing science in a way that it's just they're doing it through fiction. And, I think a lot of the conversations we've had today are exactly that, right? A lot of what needed to happen to make Dark was a lot of doing science. And the fiction was an important part of the motivating factor behind all that. But there's a lot of science behind the fiction, both on and off the screen. So, it's a part of an ongoing sort of thing people often say about writers, but I think we could say equally about production cultures, VFX artists like yourself. You are in many ways part of that tradition. So it's been really wonderful to talk to you on that, Nicholas.
Thank you.
Well, let's, Nicholas. You have a podcast yourself, Nicholas. Is this right? Let's just talk about that for a second, because it's a new venture of yours, or is it something you've started for a while?
So two friends of mine that are also visual effects artists, and me, we basically started this podcast a few months ago with the first episode of The Mandalorian. So we basically just decided to get things started. We had one episode of the podcast every week discussing the every episode of The Mandalorian from our perspective. So also a little bit, we were also talking a little bit about the visual effects, about the special way of shooting The Mandalorian, since they've been using this new technology of virtual production. And since The Mandalorian is done now, we basically moved on to it's a movie podcast, a film podcast. So we're basically speaking about films. So next week we'll have an episode about Groundhog Day-like movies.
Cool.
And it's in German though. So for everybody who knows German or who wants to learn German, go ahead, please listen to it. It's called Filmkollektiv 3000, so Filmkollektiv 3000. And it's on Spotify and Apple and Google and so on.
Terrific. Well, I want to listen to it. My German probably isn't up to snuff, but I'll have to get Chris to sort of listen with me and translate, because you're much better at these things. But it sounds like a really wonderful show. So anyone out there who does have the linguistic capabilities and is better than me in languages, which is not that hard a bar to pass, to be honest, do check it out. And thanks very much. And is that on social media at all? Or if people wanted to find you on Twitter or Facebook, or is that a thing? Or do we keep off such dark waters?
Yeah, we have an Instagram, which is Filmkollektiv 3000, and the Twitter is Filmkollektiv 3K.
Terrific. Well, we'll certainly be sure to follow you on those. Nicholas, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast. It's been really wonderful talking about Dark with you, and for introducing us to the show, really, because we've been watching it sort of in bits and spots over the last few months, and it's been a really, it's made the lockdowns go by in much quicker than they would have otherwise. So thank you for that, and it's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it a lot as well.
Well, thank you. Of course, you can find us at fantasy-animation.org, where you can access all our blog posts and the archive of podcasts. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Reddit at FanAnim Research, FANANIM Research. And you can send us an email if you like at the same handle at gmail.com. I always forget to plug that one. But if you do have any comments, feedback, thoughts, you can contact us that way as well. Give us a like, subscribe, do some star ratings, whatever you need. Helps us with the visibility as always. You've been really great at it thus far, but anything else will be helped and appreciated. And that's been us for another episode, and we'll see you either next time or before now or somewhere in between, but we'll let you decide that. Take care in the meantime, and bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.